Cheerilee finally snapped back to reality, and she turned towards the door. She couldn't let herself get sloppy. Applejack and Fluttershy hadn't gone far enough in to lose track of their position, so the odds of Applejack finding her way out again were quite high. Cheerilee silently moved through the inner sanctum until she finally arrived at a position from which she could easily keep an eye on the other mare. Fluttershy's death seemed to have finally uncovered Applejack's repressed grief, so Cheerilee didn't expect her to be going anywhere anytime soon. She smiled as she put a hoof onto one of the levers that had been built into the wall. This was too easy. As she pulled down on the lever, the faintest of clicks alerted Applejack to the fact that something wasn't quite right. The reflexes she had honed during countless hours of sporting events and general athleticism kicked in as she jumped backwards, just in time to avoid the trap door opening underneath her hooves. Cheerilee cursed under her breath. Applejack looked around quickly, scanning the area. She finally put one and one together. Twist. The door that had trapped Fluttershy. And the trap door just now. Some pony was watching her. "Show yourself!" she shouted, but Cheerilee remained silent, frantically thinking of ways to resolve the increasingly problematic situation. There was no easy way to drive Cheerilee out of hiding, and Applejack was fairly aware of that. She'd just be a sitting duck if she remained where she was, so there was only one option open to her: run and get the others. They'd be far harder to pick off if they were together, and aware of a threat to boot. She turned around on her damaged hooves and started galloping towards the exit. Her personal problems momentarily vanished from a corner of her mind, along with the stinging pain her injuries caused her. Getting herself killed wouldn't bring back her loved ones, so Applejack didn't intend to kick the bucket anytime soon. Cheerilee felt her heart pounding inside of her throat. She couldn't let Applejack reach the exit. There was simply too much at stake. She cursed once again and gave chase. For a while, it seemed Applejack actually had a good chance to make it, easily staying ahead of her much less athletic opponent as she dashed through the hallways, rounding corners at breakneck speed. But Cheerilee hadn't played all her cards yet. She'd never match Applejack for endurance or speed, but she had the terrain advantage. She knew exactly where Applejack was going, so it was relatively easy for her to make several shortcuts and secret passages without having to worry about losing her prey. Applejack ran faster than ever, adrenaline pushing her body to feats of speed that have won her a blue ribbon or two at the racing track. She lowered her head to make her body as aerodynamic as possible as the entrance hall came into sight. Cheerilee's muscles protested under the effort, but a broad grin split across her face as she reached her destination, mere seconds ahead of Applejack. She wasted no time, and immediately rammed her hoof against the hidden trigger in the wall. It swung open, and Applejack's speed made a collision inevitable. She crashed into the wall head first, coming to a complete stop instantly as she collapsed into a heap. "What in the hay?" Applejack groaned as stars swarmed in front of her eyes. She looked up through a haze as the sounds of footsteps drew near. "Who?" Applejack's only answer came in the form of a fuchsia-colored hoof, rapidly expanding to fill her entire field of vision, followed by an explosion of pain, and then nothing at all. Ugh. Applejack opened her eyes groggily, and immediately realized she was in an entirely different part of the complex. Lighting conditions were even worse than before, and it took her eyes a few moments to grow adjusted to it. She tried to sit up and look around, but quickly found that wasn't an option. Two metal bands strapped her hind legs against a wooden table she was lying on, and her forelegs were being held in place above her head by two metal wrist cuffs, connected to chains which disappeared from view through two holes in the table. There was a big lever just behind her head, and the table itself seemed to be made out of an upper and a lower part, with some sort of crank handle built into the side where the two parts met. This function eluded her, and, as she looked around the room, she saw several contraptions which seemed just out of place, but which would have looked quite inconspicuous in a sawmill or smithy. "Hello, Applejack," Cheerilee said, conversationally, as she stepped out of the shadows. "Getting comfy, I see." "Cheerilee? You... what?" Applejack stammered. "So you're the one who killed Applebloom and Fluttershy?" "Yes," she said in the same tone of voice she'd used when discussing the weather. "Although, I guess Fluttershy could be chalked up to the beetles." You monster!" Applejack shouted as she fought against her constraints. "When I get out my hooves on you, I'll..." Now, Applejack," Cheerilee said as she turned towards the other mare, looking her in her eyes. "It's unbefitting for the element of honesty to make promises she can't keep." Applejack gritted her teeth in frustration. Her situation was indeed grim, but perhaps she could just get one hoof free. "I don't want to play unfair, though," Cheerilee said as she revealed a rusty knife. "So, why don't we play a little game?" "What kind of game?" Applejack said suspiciously, keeping a close eye on the dagger. She braced herself when Cheerilee raised the knife above her head, but the teacher just drove it into the table between Applejack's hind legs. "A survival game," Cheerilee said, barely concealing excitement. "If you survive, I'll let you go." She pulled over to the head of the table and grabbed hold of the large lever standing there. She pulled it down, and the chains connected to Applejack's wrist cuffs loosened up, allowing her upper body a greater degree of freedom. At the same time, a giant circular saw noisily sprang to life on the other side of the room and started to move closer. "Wait! You can't do this! You'll never get away with it!" Applejack screamed as she desperately tried to buck her hind legs free from her bonds. "Get away with it?" Cheerilee laughed. "I already have." Applejack desperately tried to get her wrist cuffs off, but she quickly realized it was of no use, and besides, she didn't need to get the cuffs off to get out of the saw's way. Her hind legs were the real problem. She tried to reach for the metal bands on the other side of the table, but the chains were way too short. The furthest she could reach were her thighs, and the knife Cheerilee had driven into the table. The knife! Her eyes widened as she realized the only way out, and the option that Cheerilee had left open to her. "You monster!" she spat in disgust as she pulled the rusty knife out of the table. Cheerilee didn't respond, content just watching her victim struggle against her fate, deriving a perverse sense of pleasure from the near-perfect execution of her hastily devised plans. Applejack hesitated for a moment, carefully considering her next move. She almost attempted throwing the knife straight at Cheerilee, but that probably wouldn't do her much good. Even under ideal circumstances, she wouldn't have bet on her own knife-throwing skills. So, as it stood, it would probably not even qualify as a symbolic gesture, let alone a serious attack. On top of that, the knife was her only way out, and her desire to live was strong. She tried to swallow back her fear, but the shaking of her hoofs didn't stop. She slowly lowered the knife to her right thigh, slightly pressing the blade against it. Cold sweat broke out all over her body, and she breathed heavily. She glanced up at the giant saw that awaited her, already half a meter closer than it had been before, and closed her eyes as she finally pressed down the blade. She gasped for breath as soon as the blade broke her skin, pain flaring up through her leg. She opened one eye and saw her own blood slowly welling up around the blade, dripping down her leg. She pushed harder, and the blade sank into her leg, a bit deeper. But as she gasped for breath, she realized she'd never pulled this off. The blade's edge was simply too dull. She whimpered as she started to move the knife back and forth, the rough and serrated edges of the blade tearing at her, ripping her flesh apart. She squirmed and yelped in pain with every cut, but there was no going back. She wanted to live. She started cutting more frantically, and the wound became increasingly messy. Where at first there had only been a single incision, there was soon a bloody mess of semi-connected, mangled pieces of flesh as she failed to stay on target. Applejack pushed on despite the tears welling up in her eyes, but her stomach nearly turned over when she finally struck bone, sending a wave of agony coursing through her body. Her breathing became ragged and labored, fear pounding in her throat. Cheerilee watched it all gleefully, drawing closer and closer to the table to get a better look. She'd seen the fun in getting her victims to be responsible for a part of the damage long ago, but she'd never actually made them carry out the deed with their own hooves. Seeing a pony driven to self-mutilation was exciting, and the fact that she had maneuvered her victim into that situation excited her all the more. Applejack let out a broken sob, as she soon realized the knife was going to cut through the bone in a hurry, and she shakily lifted her hoof in order to proceed with the flesh underneath on the other side. The sight of her frayed leg made her sick, but she was forced to continue, watching to have any chance of success. By now, the entire bottom part of the table was soaked in blood, and the red mess hampered the accuracy of her cuts as well. She finally got through all the flesh, and her femur was the only thing that still connected the now defunct pieces of meat to the rest of the body. She whimpered in pain as she held the tip of the blade against the bone with her left hoof, raising her right hoof above her head. She took a deep breath to try to calm down, her vision clouded by tears. Applejack screamed and yelled out as she closed her eyes and rammed her right hoof down into the blade's handle, attempting to drive it straight into the bone, as if it was a chisel. The blade slipped off, and she gasped as the shock spread throughout her entire body. Her resistance finally broken, and she had just enough time to lean over the edge of the table as her stomach emptied herself. She sobbed in pain, but she realized she still had a long ways to go. She put the blade back in place and started to really hammer it down, each blow even more agonizing than the last. A little crack started to form, and with a last grunt of effort, Applejack finally drove the knife straight into her femur, accompanied by the disgusting sound of splintering bone. Desperately, she grabbed the knife with both hooves, roughly tilting it from left to right, in an effort to snap the bone completely. She grunted as her entire femur split under her efforts. Her right leg snapped off unevenly, leaving her with nothing but a sharp piece of bone sticking out of her thigh. She let her head fall back onto the table as she pressed one of her forelegs up against her eyes, crying in pain and laughing at the same time. She never thought she'd be happy to have amputated her own leg, but there she was, laughing like a maniac. She finally realized she had not one, but two hind legs, and the laughter quickly died out. She lifted her head weakly, the effects of blood loss already setting in, and saw right away that the saw had covered most of the distance towards the table. With only half a meter left, she'd never make it. Her lips trembled as she placed the bloody knife against her other leg, and her hooves were shaking even worse than before. She couldn't even make any sort of cut before she felt all of her strength and force of will flee her body, and she broke down into sobs of pain and fear. No, Celestia, I don't want to die, she whimpered, the saw just inches away from the table. Well, why didn't you say so? Cheerilee chimed in as she pulled the lever in the other direction, again stopping the saw dead in its tracks. At the same time, the chains pulled Applejack's forelegs right into place again, and she once again couldn't move an inch. Cheerilee walked over to the side of the table, and Applejack looked at her with an expression of both pain and perplexion on her face. But, you said... Cheerilee laughed heartily. Oh, Applejack, so honest that you've forgotten. Ponies can lie. Have you? But, don't worry, your sacrifice wasn't entirely for nothing, she said, before bending down and licking some of the blood off of Applejack's stump. I like it best when it's still warm, you see. Applejack cringed with both pain and disgust as she felt Cheerilee's tongue creep on the open wound. You're sick, she uttered through clenched teeth. They should put you down. Cheerilee glared angrily as the other mare. She wasn't the one who needed to be put down. Applejack was. That meant she was obviously lying. And for some reason, that stung Cheerilee. As if she had expected the element of harmony to be above that. She reached under the table and grabbed one of many items she had stored there just in case. You talk too much, Applejack, Cheerilee hissed. But, buck you, I'll talk when Cheerilee lunged forward like a snake, swiftly catching Applejack's tongue with a set of metal clamps connected to a long piece of rope. Applejack tried to pull her tongue out of the device, but it was already far too late, as Cheerilee wound the rope around her left hoof and pulled the tongue out as far as it would go. Ah, I did warn you, Cheerilee said with a feigned compassion. Let my tongue go, Applejack spat back at her with some difficulty. Cheerilee bent down through her knees, trying to grab hold of the knife Applejack had dropped earlier. The clamps pulled heavily on the farm pony's tongue, and she gurgled dryly as the pain intensified. Finally, Cheerilee managed to grab the knife, and Applejack almost sighed in relief as the pull on her tongue decreased to less unpleasant levels, even though Cheerilee still made sure it was pretty much entirely outside of her mouth. Without any warning, Cheerilee suddenly rammed the rusty knife down into Applejack's shoulder, causing the mare's teeth to clench down in pain. Blood started to well up from her mouth as her teeth tried to mash her tongue together, sinking deep into the soft, fleshy organ, but not managing to bite through it entirely. Even though pony teeth were relatively blunt, there was a lot of power behind their jaws, and Cheerilee had fully expected the tongue to come clean off. Applejack roared in pain, letting out several yelps and unintelligible moans as blood ran down her chin. Cheerilee pulled out the now badly damaged tongue once again, and Applejack's shrieks of pain intensified. Cheerilee knew she'd easily be able to pull the tongue out completely, but what was the fun in that? She slowly began to twist the knife around Applejack's shoulder, and the mare fought the control, the urge to clench her teeth down, despite the shaking and twisting of her own body. It was a battle she was destined to lose, and her teeth slowly closed, slightly below the point she had bitten down on earlier. Even more blood started to bubble out of her mouth, and she tasted its irony flavor as it ran down her throat. Her tongue continued to be crushed, and her yelps and moans turned into a wet gurgling sound, her body fighting against its bindings as the pain overwhelmed her mind. Cheerilee finally jammed the knife right underneath Applejack's shoulder blade, and the mare finally bit down hard, cutting through the last fiber of flesh that held her tongue connected to the rest of her body. With a triumphant scream, Cheerilee tossed the dismembered tongue aside, bringing her face close to Applejack's, to drink in all the details of her twisted and contorted face, as the farm pony fought to spit out or otherwise swallow the blood flowing from her mouth. "See, Applejack? See? I helped! I made you better! You prided yourself on honesty? Well, I've made sure you never tell a lie! Ever! Aren't you happy?" Cheerilee said, with a maniac look on her eyes, before bursting into laughter. "Well, too bad I can't let you enjoy it for too long." Cheerilee walked over to the crank handle on the other side of the table giddily, ignoring the disgustingly wet and sloppy sounds Applejack was making in her struggle to stay conscious. The fuchsia-colored mare put her hooves on the table and started to turn the crank as fast as she could. To Applejack's great horror, both the head and end of the table started to rise, as the table itself folded in on itself, with Applejack stuck right in the middle. Pretty soon, she found her body bending into an almost impossible shape, and the crankshaft groaned under Cheerilee's efforts to overcome the resistance of Applejack's body. "You're a weed, Applejack. A weed. Just like your sister. Just like your friends. But don't worry, Applejack. Don't worry. I've got your redemption right here." "No! Don't!" Applejack screamed, spitting out splinters of blood all over herself. Cheerilee didn't listen, and threw her full body weight onto the handle, and Applejack screamed as her spine almost audibly snapped. She instantly felt like she lost all feeling in one hind leg that remained connected, and both sides of the table were now almost vertically positioned. The chains had apparently loosened up, and Applejack desperately tried to push the two sides away from each other. It didn't matter. She only had one good leg left, and even if she had two, she simply lacked the strength. Cheerilee continued to turn the crank around, and she watched in fascination and delight as Applejack's entire mid-body got reduced to a red, bloody paste, which got squeezed out from beneath the tables, falling onto the ground with a sloppy sound that most closely resembled the one you heard when trying to pull your boots out of wet mud. The mare's resistance quickly faded, and she threw up a torrent of blood all over herself, as her head fell to the side. The pressure on her chest made breathing almost unbearable, and her hind legs, including the one no longer attached, pressed into her cheek. She looked up at Cheerilee, pleadingly, with half-open eyes, as if it was even a form of mercy that could save her by that point. "I'd asked for last words, but..." Cheerilee threw her weight against the crank one last time, slamming the table shut. Applejack barely managed a whimper as her ribcage splintered and her skull split open, smearing her brains open between the tables as the blood spattered around. One of her eyes popped out just before she got crushed, and it rolled up against Cheerilee's hoof. She quickly turned the crank in the other direction, opening the table again to marvel at the patterns of Applejack's blood, fur, bones, and internal organs had left for her. "Now this," she said breathlessly, "is art." She spotted Applejack's tongue, lying in a puddle of blood a few meters away, and she suddenly had an idea. She scooped up the tongue and promptly deposited it into the glass jar she had transported the beetles in earlier. She held it up, admiringly, and admired it in the weak light. "Shame, really," she mused. "I bet she was a wonderful kisser."